The devil is real. I know. I built his cage.
Hey, hope your internet's going well. Let's talk about Doom 3. This game is divisive, to say the least. Doom 3 came out over 7 years since the last entry in the series, and nearly a decade since the last Doom game developed by id Software. That's a very long time in between releases, especially back then. Combine that with Doom's legendary status, it's safe to say that people had some high expectations for this game. Today, I want to look back at what made Doom 3 such a controversial game, and how it holds up nearly 20 years after its initial release. Before we get into the game itself though, we first need to decide which version to look at. There's two options, the original 2004 release and the 2012 release known as the BFG edition. At first glance, these might look very similar, but these two games are actually very different to one another. For reasons that I'll get into a bit later, I believe that the best way to play Doom 3 today is with the original 2004 release, which is the version that I'm going to be looking at for this video. Now you could just download this version and get started, which will give you a decent experience, but we can make it better. First, I'm using a source port of the game, which adds some nice improvements like bug fixes, higher quality sound effects, and native widescreen monitor support without having to use console commands. And then I'm also using a couple mods to improve the overall visuals of the game, with things like higher resolution textures and higher quality models without affecting its original art direction. I'll have these mods in the video description if you would like to check them out for yourself. If you ask me, this is the best way to experience Doom 3 today. Alright, let's begin. Visually, Doom 3 is a stunning looking game, even by today's standards. Doom 3 uses the id Tech 4 engine, and what an engine it is. This was one of the earliest game engines to support dynamic lighting, which is essentially the driving force behind the entire experience. These are used absolutely everywhere, from the lights hanging on the ceiling, to imps throwing fireballs, and so much more. This was such a massive upgrade in terms of presentation compared to any id Software game before this. Sure, id's older titles look great, but having such realistic lighting really improves the experience for the style of game that Doom 3 is. Doom 3 is obviously not a traditional Doom title, and instead leans much more into being more of a horror game. Because of that, the visuals suddenly became way more important than they were in previous Doom games. This game had to look good, because if you ask me, a horror game with a bad atmosphere is a bad horror game. Fortunately, Doom 3 nails it in pretty much every aspect of its visuals. The environments in this game look amazing, and everything is so detailed, way more than you would expect for a game this old. Every room in this game is filled with objects and little nods to the world of Doom. The industrial setting is consistent throughout the whole game, aside from one part, which I'll get to later. The sound design is also great in this game. The weapon and enemy sound effects hold up quite well, but it's the environmental sounds that really stand out. Everything from pipes bursting to distant screams all help in creating a super immersive atmosphere. Same goes for the soundtrack. Well, it's not really a soundtrack outside of the main theme song, but rather some really good ambience that helps amplify the tension of whatever you're currently doing. Now there are a couple things about Doom 3's presentation that doesn't hold up very well. The main one is definitely the game's character models. Yeah, these aren't great, even by 2004 standards. They look fine at a distance, but these really fall apart once you get up close to them, which you do fairly often. They look so fake and lifeless, like they're made of plastic almost. The facial animations also leave a lot to be desired. Same goes for the enemy models. The models themselves actually look quite good, especially given you really only see these in the dark, but it's the lack of interesting designs that I don't like. Now anyone that's ever played Doom 2 before could tell you all about how great its iconic enemy roster is. Every enemy had a very distinct silhouette that you could instantly identify from basically any distance. That's not the case in Doom 3. A lot of these enemies look so similar to one another, and the ones that don't look super dull. Almost every enemy has this kind of grayscale color to them, and I don't know, I get what they were going for, but I just don't like how most of these look. Some of them look borderline unfinished. Now I'm not asking for neon pink enemies like some of the ones that we had in classic Doom, but a little color really could have gone a long way here. Aside from that complaint though, Doom 3's visuals hold up incredibly well today, and it remains one of the most immersive experiences that you will find in any game.
The Union Aerospace Corporation is the largest corporate entity in existence. Originally focused on weapon and defense contracts, new ventures have expanded into biological research, space exploration, and other scientific endeavors. With unlimited funds and the ability to engage in research outside of moral and legal obligations, the UAC controls the most advanced technology ever conceived.
In terms of story, Doom 3 actually has quite a lot going on. Unlike the previous Doom games, which had very little in terms of a narrative aside from the occasional wall of text, the story here is front and center. Doom 3 is set on Mars, in a place fittingly named Mars City. The story begins with a brief voiceover that quickly gets us up to speed with a company known as the Union Aerospace Corporation, or the UAC for short. We're then introduced to some of the main characters that we'll be interacting with, Elliot Swan and Jack Campbell. We also see the protagonist that we'll be playing as, who doesn't have a name in typical Doom fashion. Everyone just calls him Marine instead. This is not the same Doom guy from Doom 1 through 64, he's a new character exclusive to this game. These guys were all sent here to investigate some incidents that have been occurring at the facility lately. A quick security scan later, and we're then given a device called the Personal Data Assistant, or PDA. This is essentially Doom 3's replacement to the old keycard system that was present in the older Doom games, acting as our means of progressing through locked doors and other restricted areas. It's also good for reading up on the lore of Doom 3 through employee emails and audio logs, if you're into that kind of thing. I tend to avoid doing this in most games because it's usually not super interesting, but I would recommend you take the time to read and listen to most of these, as they're usually quite interesting and add a lot of additional context as to what's going on. Next, we're introduced to a guy named Malcolm Betruger. Can you tell he's the villain? This is your standard bad guy wants power and does bad things to get it character, whose only real purpose is to get the plot moving and to give us someone to hate for obvious reasons. None of the characters in this game are all that interesting or memorable, because you aren't given much time to get to know any of them. Their purpose is to give you things to do, nothing more and nothing less. Anyway, we're given our first assignment, which involves finding a missing scientist in a decommissioned communications facility. Making our way there, we start to get the feeling that things aren't all as they should be. We eventually find the scientist, who was trying to send out a warning to Earth about what he knows has been going on in Mars City. Then, all hell breaks loose. A shockwave caused by a failed teleportation experiment is sent all throughout the base, causing most of its employees to be turned into zombies, as well as allowing hordes of demons to come through. Our new objective is clear: find Betruger and close the hell portal. Did that sequence remind you of anything? Intro text that sets up the story, getting to explore the world for a few minutes, getting the feeling that something is off just before everything goes wrong. This game's opening level is basically a one-to-one copy of Half-Life. I'm not even saying that that's a bad thing. Half-Life's intro is basically perfect, so it makes sense why the developers would try to mimic it in their own games. It's just so on the nose. I mean, they didn't even try to hide it. To be fair, it works. It gets you up to speed on the world and its characters very quickly. Now, Doom 3's story on a surface level is nothing new. A normal guy goes into work, expecting just another day when suddenly everything goes wrong, and it's up to him to save the day. It's a story everyone has heard 100 times before. What makes Doom 3's story work, though, is everything else surrounding it. The UAC, for example, is a fairly major part of every Doom game before this, but we never get to see what they do. Here, though, we get to see real-time what it is that the UAC actually does. We get to learn about the experiments that they were conducting, what new weapon technology they were researching, and the people behind this stuff. Same goes for the Hell Invasion. In every other Doom game, the campaign begins after the Hell Invasion has already happened, but here, we get to see it happen ourselves and even be a part of it. You gotta remember too, you aren't playing as Doom Guy here with his incredible strength. You're just a regular dude faced with overwhelming odds. These parts are the real highlight of Doom 3's story, and regardless of what me or anyone else says about the rest of this game, no one can deny that this is good stuff. Alright, let's talk about the gameplay now. Doom 3's gameplay is not what you would expect from a game with the word Doom in the title. Unlike the previous Doom games, which are known for their fast-paced combat, Doom 3 takes a much different approach. Given the more atmospheric, horror-style nature of the game, the combat also had to change. This game simply wouldn't work if you were running around at Mach speed with a huge arsenal of weapons that never had to be reloaded. So instead, Doom 3 focuses on much more strategic combat. The two main things that require some getting used to are the flashlight and having to manually reload every weapon. The flashlight is by far Doom 3's most controversial feature. Doom 3 is a dark game, like a really, really dark game. So because of that, you're given a flashlight very early that you'll need to use to find your way around. This itself is not what a lot of people dislike. What a lot of people dislike is the fact that you have to manually swap to the flashlight whenever you need to use it, leaving you defenseless. Now I understand why some people don't like this. It interrupts combat, and it can get old having to switch back and forth between this and a regular weapon. I think the flashlight is one of the best parts of this game. Not because it's like a super fun mechanic or anything, but because of the way that it forces you to play this game. If you had a shoulder-mounted flashlight, so much of this game's atmosphere immediately gets thrown out the window. Remember that BFG edition I mentioned earlier? Well, that version of this game does feature a shoulder-mounted flashlight, and I think it drastically worsens the experience because of it. In that version, you can just blast through every room without the feeling of dread or without the thought of what might be waiting for you in the dark, because you always have that light source to rely on. Compare this to the original version. You need to be constantly thinking about what you want to have equipped for certain situations. Do you want to have the flashlight in favor of better visibility but risk not being able to defend yourself right away? Or do you want to have a gun out but risk walking straight into an enemy because you couldn't see them? And it's not just the flashlight that lessens the atmosphere in the BFG edition. That version is much brighter in most areas compared to the original, and they also added much more ammunition pickups throughout each level. Those things all take away from what is meant to be a survival horror experience, and is why I almost never recommend this version of Doom 3 to someone. I say almost because there are exceptions to that. For example, if someone just doesn't like horror games or slower paced games in general, then yeah, the BFG edition is likely going to be better for them. Now aside from the flashlight, Doom 3's gameplay is fairly typical for a game like this. You start out with just a basic handgun like in classic Doom, and slowly work your way up to having a pretty large arsenal of weapons to use. All the series staples are here, like the shotgun, the chain gun, the plasma rifle, the rocket launcher, and the iconic BFG. Real quick, I know it's become a bit of a joke to say that the shotgun in this game is one of the worst weapons in any shooter, but it's actually pretty good if you know how to use it right. It's really just the spread that's terrible. Its damage is great if you can get it close to whatever you're shooting at. There's also a couple new weapons here that weren't in any Doom game before this, like the machine gun and the soul cube. The machine gun is really just a worse chain gun, but the soul cube is much more interesting. This is an item you acquire towards the end of the game and allows you to one-shot any enemy you want. It's your classic, I don't want to deal with you type weapon. You can't just spam it though, you have to recharge it by killing enemies with your normal weapons. I would say Doom 3's combat is pretty solid for the most part, but there are a few things that I don't like about it. By far my biggest complaint is this thing that happens whenever you take damage. For some reason, getting hit in this game causes your entire perspective to either shift up or down. id Software must have really been proud of their ceiling and floor textures in this game, given how much the enemies force you to look at them. They also like to hide enemies right behind doors so that you get hit when you open them, which will get you the first couple times, but gets really annoying after a while. There's also some boss fights spread throughout the campaign, but these are all pretty underwhelming because they're extremely short and very easy. Now aside from the combat, Doom 3's gameplay is fairly run-of-the-mill for a horror game. Your objectives typically revolve around stuff like turning on the power or going to collect an item for someone. You know, stuff like that. It can get pretty repetitive after a while, but the game does change things up every now and then. The best example of this is in one of the later chapters when you go to Hell. This is by far Doom 3's best level, and it's the one that everyone remembers. Here, the gameplay is a lot closer to that of a more traditional Doom game. You have unlimited sprint, and the level is entirely focused around combat. My only complaint about this part is that it doesn't last long enough. That's how good it is. So that's the gameplay of Doom 3. It's definitely got some problems, but as a whole, it delivers a very nice balance between immersive, suspenseful horror, and fun combat. In April of 2005, an expansion for Doom 3 was released called Resurrection of Evil. This is a pretty straightforward add-on for the time, but there are a few things worth mentioning. The biggest addition is definitely the Grabber. It's a new weapon that allows you to pick up objects and enemy projectiles. I wonder where they got the idea for this from. Jokes aside, it's a nice addition to Doom 3's weapon roster and expands the gameplay quite a bit. The other new addition is called the Artifact. This replaces the Soul Cube and has two main uses. The first allows you to move in slow motion, which you're required to do occasionally to progress, but it's also useful in combat, making it much easier to dodge projectiles. The second ability grants you increased melee strength, allowing you to quickly take out multiple enemies in quick succession. Now aside from those two things, there really isn't much else to say about Resurrection of Evil. It takes place after the events of Doom 3, but you play as a different Marine this time around. It does provide a more fitting ending than the base game did, which is nice, but it also does kinda suck that you have to get an expansion just to see the story through. At least that's how it used to be. A while back, they changed this game's Steam listing to include both the expansion and the BFG edition, which is nice. But aside from that, it's got all the same elements that made base Doom 3 great, and if you liked that, you'll like this too. And that's Doom 3. I know this isn't what a lot of people wanted out of a Doom game, but I think if you take Doom 3 for what it is instead of what it isn't, you'll realize that it's a pretty great game. There was originally going to be a sequel for this, but that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.